The A14 Cambridge to Huntingdon road improvement scheme in Cambridgeshire resulted in one of the largest ever archaeological excavations ever undertaken in the UK. What I'd like to do here now is to show you some of the highlights of this incredible project, which started in the field in 2016 and which has been funded by National Highways. But before I begin, here's a short video which will provide you with a glimpse of the fascinating discoveries that we found over the course of the project. Will hopefully give you some idea of the scale. So I'm going to begin with addressing a few fundamental questions on the background to the project, starting with an account of what we actually did. Initially, there was a scheme of what we call archaeological evaluation. This is really to gain an understanding of where there were archaeological remains. This took the form of desk-based research, geophysical surveys, analysis of aerial photographs, and crucially targeted trial trenching. Now, this identified 228 hectares of land where archaeological remains survived from a whole range of periods, which we'll look at today. It's from Neolithic to post-medieval. This is an area equivalent to half of Gibraltar or 5 Vatican cities. And so, as we noted, it's one of the largest archaeological projects ever undertaken. And these areas were subject to full excavation, which is what I'm going to talk about today. So why did we do it? It was part of a £1.5 billion scheme to improve the A14 road between Cambridge and Huntingdon. It was widened in places and new stretches of road in others. This created 12 miles of new roads, 10 miles of widening to existing roads, and dozens of new structures, mainly bridges and culverts. The construction of this road had an impact on the archaeology through the excavation of quarries, the creation of flood compensation areas, basically ponds, construction of compounds, and the actual construction of the new road itself. So the archaeologists needed to come and investigate the archaeology here before the construction took place. Now, as you can imagine, this project needed a huge team of archaeologists. Molar Headland Infrastructure were commissioned by National Highways to come and excavate the archaeological remains. And we worked alongside a number of other archaeological companies. In total, there were around 250 archaeologists working here from all over the world. So it was a real joint effort. And to give you some idea of the scale, we've worked out that it was 64,845 days or 177 years were spent on excavation in the scheme. And that doesn't even include the 6 years that we've spent on post-excavation work. So here are a few other images of some of our amazing team at different sites along the scheme. The majority of our staff were out in the field in all weathers across many years, and they did an incredible job. So what did this team do? That's what we're going to explore now. The first stage was machining the sites to expose the actual archaeology. While the sites had been stripped, we identified the archaeological remains and surveyed them using digital equipment as seen here. This was then processed by computer to produce a pre-excavation plan. And we continually updated this plan, which also surveyed the features again once they'd been excavated. Once the sites were stripped, we got to the task of hand excavating them. So we use hand tools, mattocks, shovels, and trowels. We were essentially excavating out the fills of the features. So when I say features, I mean pits, ditches, post holes, kilns, and burials. We were looking for finds, which can help us date the features. We were looking for environmental evidence, animal remains, and sample buckets of soil taken for plant remains, and information about what the features were. Much of this is really heavy manual work, removing the fills from large ditches, but there's also more delicate work, as you can see from this amazing Bronze Age pit burial, which I'll come back to later. Then, once the features are hand excavated, we need to record them. We do this through photographs of features, hand-drawn plans and sections, and filling in paper sheets called context sheets, which hold or record information about the feature's size, shape, depths, and fills. We produced over 100,000 of these context sheets, so that's a lot of hard work. And this is the record that we took away from the sites, which enabled us to tell the story of what was happening here in the past. The next stage is processing, cleaning, and sorting of the finds and environmental samples recovered from the sites, and entering all of this information onto databases. This stage took a long time with lots of incredibly hardworking, dedicated staff, as you can see here. This is all used then in the post-excavation phase of work, where we analyze all of the material to get information about what it is, where it was made, what date it is, and things like what it tells us about the surrounding environment. And we produced reports based upon these results of our excavations. So why are the A14 excavations so important? Firstly, the huge scale of the work and the amount of archaeology encountered from one project is almost unprecedented. Also, it lies within an area where there's been lots of other archaeological work being undertaken in advance of development in recent years. So much so that it's become one of the richest archaeological landscapes in the UK and possibly further afield. When you start to look at all of this work together, you begin to get a real understanding of how this landscape and the people in it changed over long periods of time. And another reason why these excavations we feel are so important is that it involved real collaboration across companies. Headland Archaeology and Museum of London Archaeology worked together on the project using the same systems, mixing up staff and creating a team working for the archaeology rather than for one company or another. And this was also extended to the other companies which joined us. So what I know you're really interested in is what we've been finding. So now I'm going to run through some of the highlights from the scheme as a whole, from a whole range of periods. The earliest evidence came from the really deep gravels and were in the form of animal remains, including mammoths. We've got tusks and pelvis. We've got woolly rhino, we've got bison, we've got reindeer, all from a cold, cool climate and an open floodplain environment. The overall scientific dating of these deposits was Middle and Late Devensian. That's about 60,000 to 11,000 years ago. We've also got a few Paleolithic artifacts, notably two large work flints and actual hand axe, which have been recovered, which hints also not only at the animals, but also at human activity here at the time. Now, the earliest evidence for major human activity we found dates to the Neolithic and Bronze Age. That's about 4000 BC to 800 BC, up to around 6,000 years ago. This map here shows the location of these features within the scheme, concentrated in the Great Ouse Valley to the west. It's quite difficult to find actual evidence for where people lived in this area at this time. We tend to find less evidence for their settlements or other activities apart from their worked flint or pottery and scattered pits. Instead, we often find ceremonial and burial monuments, the larger spectacular features which survived and are often revered in later periods. This is certainly the case on the A14, where we found a Neolithic henge, a sort of ceremonial monument, Bronze Age barrows, burial monuments, and a whole host of further Bronze Age burial sites. One example of these early prehistoric monuments was a late Neolithic, early Bronze Age henge from the western part of the scheme in the Great Ouse Valley, as seen here, this circular feature in the foreground. These are large circular monuments formed of substantial ditch surrounded by a bank, this one being 20 meters in diameter with 2 opposing entrances. And it had 2 also early Bronze Age cremation burials just to the south of it, which were noted. They're typically empty. There's no obvious archaeologically detectable features like burials, for example, within them. So we're really unsure of their function, but they are likely to be ceremonial gathering spaces. We've also found a large number of Bronze Age burials. These include 9 inhumation burials where the body was placed unburnt into the ground, and 143 cremation burials spanning the whole of the Bronze Age period. Most of these come from cremation cemeteries, including in some inserted into earlier barrows of burial mound monuments. The inhumation burial seen here, that one there, was located 40 meters south of a Middle Bronze Age cremation cemetery in an upright squatting position, accompanied by a Bronze Age awl that's used for perforating leather, wood, or boneworking or other crafts. It was obviously deemed a significant enough object to place with the individual. The image to the right shows CT scans of a large Bronze Age cremation urn. So this is fantastic because you actually get to see inside the cremation vessel prior to actually excavating it. So now we're going to move forward into the Iron Age, 800 BC to AD 43. The evidence for activity at this time changes considerably. Here we see very little evidence for human burial or ceremonial features, but instead we have evidence for large numbers of settlements, particularly farmsteads where people were living and farming the land around them. On this scheme, we found 17 sites with evidence for Iron Age activity. You can see along the scheme here. All of them a bit different and representing the variety of people who lived there. Only one, seen here in the central part of the scheme, could be dated to the earlier part of the Iron Age, about 800 to 400 BC. And the rest of them represent an explosion of seemingly new settlement from the Middle Iron Age, that's about 400 BC onwards. Many of these were continuously occupied throughout the Iron Age and into the Roman period, which is interesting as it allows us to see what the impact of the Roman conquest was on everyday people living there. So this is one example of an Iron Age farm at the western end of the scheme. It's typical in some ways, although there was a large degree of variation in the form and scale of such settlements. Here you can see linked Iron Age enclosures, and you can also see a number of roundhouses where people would have lived within them highlighted here, as well as some other small post-built structures, possibly for grain storage. This is an aerial photograph of one of our Iron Age sites at the western end of the scheme. You can see dark, wide curving lines, which are the old river channels. And within some of these, there are smaller, thinner lines, which are Iron Age enclosures. These fitted within the lines of the river channels with some evidence for bridges crossing the old rivers. The settlements here would have been using the rivers as a water source, although, of course, they would also have caused issues with flooding, which indeed they seem to have done. This is a drone shot showing another one of our sites, Iron Age sites at the eastern end of the scheme near Bar Hill. You can see the dark grey lines, which are the lines of the ditches that marked out the enclosures of the settlement. The curvilinear enclosures are the Iron Age ones, which are overlain by the more sort of regular rectilinear Roman enclosures. This shows that people were living on this site from the Iron Age into the Roman period and shows the impact of the Roman conquest on everyday people. Now, we found some really interesting Iron Age finds in the course of our work, and just a few of them I'll highlight here. This included a bone comb made from a piece of human skull seen in the bottom left here. Now, this was actually fairly fresh when it was made. It was fashioned into a subrectangular comb with a single perforation, presumably for suspension. It's one of a small number of known examples of these from Cambridgeshire, although similar examples are known from France. Above the comb is the only bit of gold we found in the entire scheme, which is remarkable considering the scale of the scheme. This was a late Iron Age coin from a ditch near a roundhouse. It was called a uniface stater dating to around 50 BC, probably minted by the Ambiani tribe on the Somme in Gaul in modern-day France. And further to the right is one particularly intriguing discovery from part of an Iron Age roundhouse gully. Here, more than 8,000 frog bones from over 350 individuals were found deposited in a short section of the gully. And what were they doing here? It's really not certain, but suggestions go from everything from food waste to even disease. Unfortunately, we're never really going to know for certain. We're now going to move on into the Roman period, after the Claudian conquest of AD 43, right up until the early 5th century AD. Now, we found a lot of evidence for Roman activity across the scheme. Much of this comprises Roman settlements, again, mainly small farmsteads, but also some more higher status and substantial sites, possible distribution and trading centres. We've also uncovered evidence about what the Roman people were doing. Lots of things like pottery kilns and large areas of the agricultural landscapes that prove that they were fairly intensively farming much of this area. Overall, we're seeing a comprehensive slice through a really densely populated and worked landscape between two walled towns at Cambridge and Godmanchester. I'm just going to talk about a few of the highlights from the Roman period and scheme. Now, one of these settlements is what is believed to be a Roman villa on the east banks of the River Great Ouse. This started as a substantial farmstead, which in turn developed from an Iron Age farm and developed into a villa in the later 3rd century, defined by large rectangular double-ditched enclosure you can see there, with quite an elaborate entranceway. Unfortunately, we didn't get to excavate the main villa building, which is thought to lie in the central part of the enclosure, but you can see an idea of what it may look like from that reconstruction. We had a number of aisle buildings found in the complex, including one with surviving elm posts, as seen here. Now, it's unusual to get surviving posts in any case, but this is particularly unusual as elm is very rare in the Roman period. This one comes from building which is interpreted as a blacksmith's workshop. We've also found fragments of elaborate architectural stone, no doubt originally from the villa building, and other signs that high status people were living here, such as mosaic fragments, hypocores, that's heating systems, elements, and a very rich finds assemblage, as well as some evidence for more exotic plants, including fig. It's generally very different from most of the other Roman period settlements we've excavated across the scheme. Now, aside from settlements, one exciting discovery was over 40 Roman pottery kilns from across the scheme, essentially an entirely new industry for this area. Some of these have been found on their own, literally individual kilns adjacent to Roman settlements, where potters would have made the pots necessary for them and their families. Others have been found in small groups of between 5 and 10 kilns, most located on areas around the River Great Ouse. There's also some indication of one site of actually a small potter's workshop. There's a cobbled surface, possibly where the potters were preparing their clay, surrounded by numerous large pits, sort of water holes or clay extraction pits. All of this next to the pottery kiln. Now, one of the things to note about the Roman phase is that it produced the most abundant material of any other period, even though it lasted only 350 years of the 1,000 years of occupation. So this included over 2.5 tons of pottery, over 900 coins, more than 500 other metal and bone finds, not including the huge numbers of iron nails that were found, and many hundreds of other finds such as quernstones or millstones used for grinding grain into flour. We also found over 1.5 tons of animal bones dating from the Roman period context, and over 2,000 environmental samples were taken from the context dating to the Roman period. All of this has been used to provide a really rich picture of how people lived and worked in this section of the Cambridgeshire countryside around 2,000 years ago. Now, one of the most impressive and I say unexpected things about this project is the amount of evidence we've found for Saxon or early medieval activity. This period is often called the Dark Ages because we hardly ever find anything information about it. So we've been incredibly lucky here with the amount of information that we managed to get. Most of our evidence derives from the western end of the scheme at Brampton in the Great Ouse Valley, although there's also an important settlement you can see there at Conington, Now, you may recall that this distribution that you can see is fairly similar to that of the earlier prehistoric sites. It's very unlike the Iron Age and Roman periods when settlements were spread more fully across the scheme. At the western end of the scheme, we found a large dispersed settlement of around 30 what are called sunken featured buildings, also known as SFBs for short, or occasionally termed Grubenhausen. This is essentially a structure with a sunken floor partially dug into the ground. And many associated large pits and wells came from the areas around these buildings. These date generally from the 5th to the 8th century and are thought to have been used for craft working, although probably had numerous functions. This includes what we're claiming, and you can see here in the bottom right corner, is what we're claiming is one of the world's largest SFBs. This absolutely measures a whopping 8.5 by 7 meters. It's far bigger than the average of these types of structures. Now, one really interesting object found within one of these SFBs was this bone reed pipe, not a flute as we first thought. This is a really rare object, probably 8th century in date, and it's voiced by the means of an inserted vibrating reed of either natural cane, reed, or bone. It would have been paired with another and joined together, and together created a sort of a deep skirling sound like a clarinet, and it was a really exciting find to find. Now, somewhat later than the more dispersed SFB settlement at Brampton was a more concentrated settlement, more nucleated settlement, comprising around 30 post-built buildings, as you can see here in the plan and the reconstruction. These were dating to around the 8th to the 10th century AD, so it's later than the dispersed SFB settlement. Now, this is of national significance, as it's where we sometimes get glimpses of a few buildings or posts, but very rarely. Most of these settlements of this date are beneath modern villages, so we don't get that much information about them. But here we have a whole settlement with complete buildings, alleyways, wells, rubbish pits, and the like. We can really see how the buildings and the layouts of the streets developed. It was the real birth of the English village that we can see here. Meanwhile, in the central part of the scheme, we found remains of an early medieval settlement at Conington, which literally means King's Town or enclosure. Here, there are earlier SFBs and post-built buildings, and part of a 7th to 9th century enclosed settlement, which we think may have been part of an administrative centre of the Mercian kingdom. This settlement included a defended gateway, which when excavated revealed an intriguing secret. It seems that as the community prepared to leave the settlement, they took down their grand entrance gate. In a pit that previously held one of the gateposts, they buried a 15-year-old girl, face down, possibly with her ankles tied together. Radiocarbon dating showed the young woman died between 680 and 880 AD, this late 7th to 9th centuries. And the very act of being buried face down in this location probably marked her out as being someone who was seen as different within the community. She certainly had evidence of childhood malnutrition and also had a spinal joint disease, made worse by carrying out hard manual labor from a young age. This all suggests she was of a low social status and tells a fascinating, if sad, story. If we now move on into the medieval period, after the Norman conquest of 1066, we can see that much of the areas we're investigating became agricultural land. This means that many of the archaeological features and the evidence that we have relates to agricultural activity, in particularly ploughing. However, we have had one particularly interesting medieval site at the western end of the scheme, the deserted medieval village of Houghton. The medieval archaeological remains here comprised a trackway going across the site and plot boundaries off the trackway, and buildings set within these plots, and a reasonable amount of evidence for industrial activity, including metalworking. We've got what we think to be a blacksmith's workshop. The settlement was likely to be an outlier to the main settlement of Brampton, as it had no church or manor house. Instead, it appears to have been an industrial zone, perhaps potentially utilising the nearby woodland. Pottery dating suggests it was occupied between the 11th and the 15th centuries, and was probably the successor to the earlier medieval settlements to the south and the southeast. The reason for the village's desertion are really unclear. One suggestion that it was related to Brampton or Harthay Woods. If the villagers depended on the woodland for food and fuel, they may have deserted the village when the wood became inaccessible. So finally, we come to the post-medieval period. Generally, at this time, much of the areas we're looking at became fields or were used for agricultural purposes. However, we have, in a few cases, found evidence for small-scale industry. On the western side of the A1, opposite Brampton, we found two large brick kilns. These are 19th century in date and were used, obviously, to make bricks. In this photo, you can see the rectangular patches of darker earth, which are called the stanks, where the clay would have been laid out in brick shapes before being put into the kiln. That's the brick feature in the foreground. The brick clamps would have been used to make bricks for individual farms, one of which was located nearby. Essentially, these were the final occupants on a site which had been lived in for thousands of years. So we've now come to the end of our journey through time within the A14 corridor, all the way from woolly mammoths to post-medieval industry, with prehistoric henges, Iron Age farms, Roman villas, early medieval settlements, and a deserted medieval village in between. I hope you'll agree it provides a fascinating insight into the evolution of a landscape over such a long period. So the final question is, what are we doing now? Well, the post-excavation program started in 2018 was what we call an assessment stage, essentially working out what we have. This was followed by a project design, which we're really figuring out what we were going to do with it in order to address the major research aims, and also how we were going to present that to as wide an audience as possible. We're now coming to the end of the analysis phase of work, and we've been producing outputs throughout much of the program aimed at different audiences. These range from academic monographs to specialist journal articles, to more general audience books and digital story maps, and a whole series of blogs and videos. We've even sponsored a number of master's students who have made incredibly valuable contributions to the project and have also helped combat the skill shortages seen within the archaeology profession. We hope that the range and diversity of the outputs that you can see here reflect some of the incredible archaeology that we've unearthed. And if you want to find out more about any aspects of the A14 project, please follow the links outlined here. And also please remember to check out all of the other A14 talks in this series. Thank you.